gentlemen, both here in the auditorium and viewing the live stream online. My name is Tripp Cardiff, Interim Director of Education here at the San Antonio Museum of Art, and it's my pleasure to welcome you all to this evening's program, Let Us Now Not Boast of Our Worldly Possessions with Lynley McAlpine. As always, our lectures and artist conversations are made possible by generous support from the Louis A. and Francis B. Wagner Lecture Fund. Before we begin, a few friendly reminders. First, please take a moment to ensure that your phone is either turned off or set to silent. Second, if you do need to excuse yourself from the program at any point, kindly exit and re-enter from the doors up in the back. And third, during the question and answer segment of the program, please raise your hand to ask a question. Dr. McAlpine will call upon you, and she'll rephrase the question for the benefit of the audience so that everyone can hear. And finally, Dr. McAlpine's book, Let Us Now Not Boast of Our Worldly Possessions, Provenance Stories from the San Antonio Museum of Art, is available for purchase in the museum shop, and Dr. McAlpine will be available following the lecture to sign a copy. It's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Lynley McAlpine, SAMA's own Associate Curator of Provenance Research. Dr. McAlpine holds a PhD in Classical Art and Archaeology from the University of Michigan. She joined SAMA in 2017 as the Association of Art Museum Directors and Kress Foundation Fellow for Provenance Research. Her tenure was then extended until 2019 with a curatorial fellowship funded by the Gilbert M. Denman Jr. Trust. From 2019 to 2023, Dr. McAlpine received a Mellon Foundation postdoctoral curatorial fellowship, which allowed her to further pursue provenance research at SAMA. During this time, she curated a Roman portrait from Germany in Texas, which many of you may remember. It explored the story of an ancient Roman portrait that was discovered in a Goodwill store in Austin in 2018. She assisted with the development of Roman landscapes, visions of nature and myth from Roman Pompeii in collaboration with Jessica Powers, and published Let Us Now Not Boast of Our Worldly Possessions, Provenance Stories from the San Antonio Museum of Art, which evolved from her multi-year research into SAMA's collection. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Lynley McAlpine.
Thank you, Tripp. I'm sorry that you had to say the extremely long title of my book so many times. You write a book, think about that. Thank you all for coming. I'm gonna have a sip of water before I start talking. I'm actually gonna start by asking you a question because it's something I'm actually really curious about. So, show of hands, how many of you are confident that you know what the term provenance means when it's used in a museum context? All right, more than half, I'd say. Nice, very nice. And don't worry if you didn't raise your hand, because if you don't know now, you're definitely gonna know by the end of my talk. You know, when I started doing provenance research at SAMA in 2017, if I had asked the same question to a similar group of people like you, people who are obviously interested in museums and art, I don't think I would have got so many hands, because when I started here and I told people what I was doing, a lot of people asked me, can you explain what that is and why does the museum want you to do that? But in recent years, I think it's become much more common knowledge. You see stories about provenance in the New York Times now, on 60 Minutes. And I'm still gonna start by explaining what provenance research actually is and why I do it, why it matters. But then after that, I'm gonna go on to talk about some of the stories that I've compiled as part of my research. So what do we mean by provenance? It's pretty simple. It means the history of a work of art or an object in the collection, and specifically, it means the history of the ownership. So it's who owned it, when they owned it, where it was when they owned it, and how and when it transferred from their ownership to someone else's. And this is something that people in museums and art historians have always been interested in to some extent, But in recent decades, and even more in recent years, it has become something that's not just a possibly interesting avenue of research, it's been recognized as a crucial part of the work that museums need to be doing. Why is that? Well, there are three main areas of provenance research that are generally considered to be sort of the most pressing. One of them is what we call Nazi-era provenance research. This means looking at artworks that may have changed ownership in Europe during the period of time that the Nazis were in power, and making sure that that change of ownership wasn't the result of looting or a forced sale by the Nazis. The Nazis confiscated the property of the people they persecuted, particularly Jews, and sold it off or planned to sell it off or reserved it for their own collections and museums. Some of this property was recovered and returned to survivors in the years following World War II, but much of it had already been sold off and ended up in private collections and museums all over the world. So we need to research anything in our collection that doesn't have a completely known history during that period, because if it was stolen from someone, it shouldn't be in a museum. The second major type of provenance research involves, I should say, if it was stolen from someone and never returned to them, it shouldn't be in a museum. The second major type of provenance research involves antiquities or archaeological materials. And this is where I started at SAMA, because as Tripp said, my background was in Roman archaeology. What we're doing here is ruling out the possibility that something was illegally excavated and or smuggled out of its country of origin. Most countries in the world now have laws that restrict the export of cultural materials, so you can't just go somewhere, dig something up, and take it home. The tricky part, of course, is that if something was secretly excavated and smuggled, we're not usually going to have a record of that because it was done secretly. So what I do is I just try to find as much information as possible, make that information publicly accessible, and pay attention to where there are dead ends. That said, a dead end, meaning we can trace something back to a certain point and then we can't find any other information, or gaps in an artwork's history, these things are more common than not in provenance. Not having all of the information isn't necessarily a sign of something terrible, it's just a lack of information. Not all of the holes in our knowledge are because someone was deliberately concealing something. Sometimes a dealer or a collector just didn't think all of the information related to the past ownership was very important or particularly interesting, and so he or she didn't record it or they didn't preserve the records of it. And sure, if something you owned was previously owned by someone really famous, then you'll probably remember that. And you'll probably pass on that information to the next owner. And if you're selling it, maybe that famous person in its history will add a little extra sort of prestige to it as well. But if you've never heard of any of the previous owners, you don't know who they are, then that information is much more likely to get lost. But I just want to say, for the sake of provenance researchers of the future, if you collect art, please keep all of your documentation. I beg you, even if you don't think it's very interesting, I promise it's interesting to me. The third category of provenance research has only very recently come to the attention of most people, and that concerns artworks or objects that were collected in colonial contexts, where one group colonized another group, and there were unequal power relations. Not everything that comes out of this kind of situation is problematic, but we have to look at them carefully. Again, you can have a situation where the group in power steals from the persecuted group or pressures them to give up important cultural property. But at the same time, you can have people among the colonized group who create art specifically in order to sell it to outsiders or to colonizers, for example. So it's just something that we need to pay attention to in our collections. So far, my research here at SAMA is focused on the first two categories, Nazi-era provenance and antiquities, but as I continue, it will encompass the rest of the museum's collection as well. So that's what and why, what, the ownership history of artworks, why, to make sure we don't have things in the collection that were stolen or looted. But now we want to talk a little bit about how. The methods and research, the methods and resources that I use to do provenance research are much more varied and sometimes strange than a lot of the academic research that I did before I started doing this. So on the screen, I have photos that I've taken during parts of my research that show some of the main methods. And let's see if I can get the pointer to work here. Yes, all right, so up at the top, we have an Egyptian stone dish. The inside of it, not the side that's usually visible on display, although I think we have a mirror behind this one, so you can't see the inside. But it has a little label inside it, and it has some initials and a number on it. And I think the initials refer to the dealer who once sold it, though I haven't been able to confirm that yet. But that's like an interesting piece of information to try and track down. One of my favorite things to do during provenance research is to look at the backs of paintings. They're so fascinating. They're filled with information as long as no one covered them up. Almost any time a painting moves, it accumulates new marks and new labels. And I'll talk about that a little bit in more detail in a minute. Some of the research I do is typical library research. So here's a big stack of books. I look at scholarly publications, auction catalogs, exhibition catalogs, and so forth. And there are also a lot of archives, and so what we see in the middle is a stock card from the Brummer Gallery, who once owned this portrait that is now in Sama's collection, and we can tell from the card that they acquired it in 1938. But I also end up looking at all sorts of other things, obituaries and wills, inventories, sometimes Hollywood gossip magazines, architecture journals, personal correspondence, and just about anything that seems like it might contain a clue. And you'll see lots more of this as I go on, because I'm going to share with you two artworks, one a 20th century painting and one a vase. You'll notice I say vase and vase interchangeably, sorry. One, a vase from the 6th century BC, where I've been able to document almost all of their modern history of ownership. And so you'll see a little bit about how that happened. So I'll start with an example of Nazi-era provenance research, where I was able to show that a work of art was not looted in Europe around the time of World War II. This is a painting from our European collection by the German painter Franz von Stuck. Something really interesting about von Stuck's paintings is that they often have these gorgeous custom frames that are designed specifically for the paintings, gilded and painted to suit the subject matter of the painting. But for my purposes, the most fun part of this painting is the back. So you can see that it has all sorts of labels and markings on it. At the bottom here is a sort of plaque from the framer who actually built this custom frame. Here in chalk, someone has written lot 18, and that was the auction lot number from when it went up for sale at a German auction in 1999. Here's another tag from an auction. Someone wrote Susanna here so that you can tell which painting it is without having to turn it around. But the most interesting and tantalizing label on the back of this one is the large one in the middle. It's pretty faded and it's in German, but I was able to make out some of what it says. So down here, it says Franz V. Stuck, the artist. Here is the title of the painting, an alternate title in German. It says Susanna im Bade, so Susanna in the bath. But the most interesting part, and also the most badly damaged part, is up at the top where it says Absender, sender, or lender. So this is the part that's going to tell us who actually owned it, right? So I was able to decipher a little bit of it myself. This word seems to be Albert. This looks like familia. And that's about all I got. So at this point, I had to reach out to some other provenance researchers who are native German speakers to see if they could get more out of it than I was able to do. They couldn't get it all either, but they pointed out that the word here seems to be general consul, and that the last name looked like it started with H, and they confirmed that this is U for and family. That was extremely helpful because I was able to sort of start with those bits of information and find out more. So I found that Franz von Stuck's daughter, Mary, had been married to a diplomat, general consul, named Albert Heilmann. And it turns out that this painting went from the artist to his daughter and her family, and it stayed with the family right down until the 1990s, when they finally put it up for auction, and it was purchased by Gilbert Denman, who was one of the founding trustees of the San Antonio Museum of Art, and he left it to the museum in his bequest. So because it stayed in the artist's family that entire time without interruption, we don't have to be concerned about it having been looted during World War II. Unfortunately, most other paintings don't have a big sticker on the back like this that tell you everything you need to know as long as you can read it. But this is fascinating to me not only because, okay, phew, we're allowed to keep this painting. It's also interesting because it tells us something about the significance of the painting. And so we know that it was something that the family held on to for generations. They lived in a fabulous Art Nouveau home that had been designed in and out by the artist, and presumably this painting was part of its decoration. It may have been in storage, but it seems likely, until sometime before 1992, when the villa was converted into a museum. And that kind of thing, these rich stories of fascinating people who are behind so many of the works of art in our collection, that was something that I hadn't really considered when I began doing provenance research. My objective then was to assist the museum in fulfilling its ethical duty to ensure that it wasn't collecting looted art. But the more I looked into these histories, the more people and their stories I encountered. Several years of my research was generously funded by the Mellon Foundation, and as part of that fellowship, I needed to publish some of the results of my research. And it seemed like an obvious choice to focus on the stories of the people behind the collection, and that project was a lot of fun, and so my book is the result of that. But since you can never include everything you want in a book, I'm excited to have a chance to sort of supplement some of that, and especially to show you more pictures. I'm also going to tell you about some stories that are some sort of discoveries that have happened since the publication of the book, because these don't stop, they keep coming. So I have a few fun things to show you, and then I'm going to go into a deep dive in that 6th century BC Greek vase that I mentioned earlier. First, water. So here we have the painting that appears on the cover of the book. It's a portrait of the glamorous Polish silent film star Pola Negri. The painting, don't need the dot, the painting was painted in Los Angeles not long after she arrived in Hollywood, but during that time she had already got engaged to Charlie Chaplin and then broke off the engagement. And of course the gossip magazines, which I had to look at in order to get the date that this painting was painted, insisted that the artist was madly in love with her. She ended up not having a lot of success in Hollywood once talkies took over because she had such a thick accent. So she went back to Europe and she made movies in Nazi Germany for several years. After the war, she returned to the US and she ended up retiring to San Antonio and living with a local radio star, Margaret West. And this particular portrait of Negri seems to have always belonged to her. She displayed it on her living room wall in San Antonio behind her couch. And I wanted to share some photos of Negri during her time in San Antonio. So in 1968, she was honored with an award for her film career in San Antonio. And these photos on your right are from events that were related to that award. So the man on the left in both of them, here and here, is Father Real. He was an instructor at St. Mary's, and he was working on a biography of Pola Negri, but he passed away before he completed it. In the upper right, we can see Gilbert Denman, who I've already mentioned, one of the founding trustees of the San Antonio Museum of Art. He was very important in the arts and culture scene of the city. I'm sure there are people here who knew him. And he was also Negri's friend and attorney. The bottom photo was actually taken in Gilbert Denman's apartment, where he displayed his antiquities collection and hosted a lot of parties before he donated it to the collection to the museum in the 1980s. And we can see two artworks in the background that are now in our Roman gallery. Here's the statue of a woman missing her head. And then just in the corner here, we can see part of a portrait of a boy. I actually don't know who the man on the right is. Maybe one of you knows who he is. If you do, wait till the end and let me know, because I'm curious. So there's kind of a secondary theme in my lecture. First, Provenance Research. Second, glamorous, eccentric women. So here's the second one. This is the French Countess Martine de Bargue. She was an heiress who married young and also separated young. And she spent the rest of her life as a world traveler, a collector, and a patroness of the arts. She had a theater constructed inside her lavish mansion in Paris, which is now the Romanian embassy. And she associated with all kinds of artists, musicians, and intellectuals. She sailed her yacht, which was called Nirvana, all over the world, collecting art everywhere she went. And I wanted to show this picture of her, which is a favorite of mine, because she looks particularly dashing and stylish with her feathered hat and her walking stick. A fantastic biography of her came out, but unfortunately, it appeared after my book was published. But it showed a lot of things from her collection, including photos like this of some of her cabinets of curiosities. And in this one, we can see two fragments of Greek pottery that are now in SAMA's galleries. So they're quite small, but they're beautiful, and the Countess clearly gave them a special place in her display here. Now I'm going to get into that other piece of research where I was able to piece together a full ownership history, and this time it's of an ancient Greek vase rather than a painting. It's hard to choose, but this pot probably has my favorite biography of anything I've researched. It was attached to so many interesting people, and it traveled to all sorts of interesting places. So in order to give you a sense of what's involved in provenance research, I'm going to go through the information in the order in which I discovered it rather than chronological order. So I'm not going to start with the earliest owner and go to the current owner, which is us. But I think this will still be easy to follow. The part that we're missing from this vase's story is actually the most important part when we're thinking about it as an archaeological artifact, and that is where it was used in antiquity and where it was found. But we can make a pretty good guess in general terms, at least. We can tell from the material and the style that it was made in the region around Athens called Attica. But it's relatively rare to find whole pots like this there because they were things that people actually used, and they used them until they broke. And if they couldn't usefully repair them, then they just threw them out. So we tend to find in Greece more broken fragments of pottery. But the Etruscans in Italy imported Greek vases and used them as grave gifts for the dead. So they were put into tombs with burials. And for that reason, we actually have a lot more whole Greek vases that come from Italy than from Greece itself. So this probably came from Italy. And there are other hints that link it possibly to Italy that I'll get to in a minute. In terms of its modern history, when I started researching this, I had the information that's on the left. And I ended up here on the right with much more information. You don't need to try to read all of this. It's just a visual aid. I'll go over the details with you. But you can see here that it was purchased in 1974 at an auction by the San Antonio Museum Association, which existed before the museum opened, but was a group planning the future art museum. And in fact, we have a letter in our files from the president of the Museum Association, Jack McGregor, to a curator at the Met named Dietrich von Baltmer, who had studied the vase before the auction, and he was letting him know that they had bought it and asking if he had any more information about it. McGregor says in that letter, quote, "I am very pleased with this vase as the beginning for our collection." So we know that it was an important purchase, and we can also see that even years before SAMA opened, they knew that they needed and wanted to have a collection of Greek art. The Sotheby's auction catalog said that it belonged to Stephen Courtauld, so I had his name. And SAMA's catalog of Greek vases, which was published in the 90s, which you can still buy in the shop, also said X Rogers under the provenance, and this is sort of a typical shorthand for previously in the Rogers collection. But it didn't have a full name for Rogers, and it didn't have any dates associated with him. With a little searching, however, I found that there was someone named Samuel Rogers who owned a collection of more than 200 Greek vases in the 19th century, and luckily, for my purposes, they were sold at auction after his death, which means that we have a published auction catalog describing them all. There it is. So I took a look through the 210 descriptions of vases, and I found one that matches the description of our pot. So that means that we can actually place our vase in London by the time of Rogers' death, at least in 1855. And that means that it was not taken out of Italy after the creation of their antiquity export laws, the first of which went into effect in 1909. So that's good news in terms of fulfilling our ethical obligations. It's okay for the museum to have this pot. So who is Samuel Rogers? He isn't well known today, but he was actually quite famous during his own lifetime. And some evidence for this is this caricature in the middle that was made by a French artist who visited London and made these little busts of famous people that he met there, including the Duke of Wellington. Rogers was a romantic poet, and during his lifetime, he was generally considered one of the greatest living poets. He was friends with Lord Byron, though eventually they had a falling out, but of course, Byron's legacy has persisted more strongly, I'd say, than Rogers. Rogers was also an intellectual and a banker, and that was a good combination for him because it allowed him to collect a lot of art and to travel, especially to Italy, which he had a special fondness for. People published descriptions of their visits to his townhouse in London, and it was apparently absolutely packed with art, all the walls, all the surfaces covered with art objects, including those 210 Greek vases that I mentioned. You can get a sense of maybe what it looked like from this engraving. Rogers was famous for the breakfasts that he hosted, where he would invite intellectuals to discuss art and philosophy and politics. This is an imagined version of one of those gatherings that's filled with all famous people. Rogers himself is the central figure here. Here's Lord Byron. And the names of the other people are written in pencil at the bottom of the engraving. And they include Sir Walter Scott, Wordsworth, Turner, the painter, who was a particularly close friend of Rogers, Lawrence, Washington Irving, etc. We don't know exactly where Rogers got the vase that's now at SAMA. His journals of his travels in Italy were published, and I looked through them to see if that had, he said something like, "Oh, today in Florence, I bought a really nice pot with Heracles on it," but I didn't have any luck. He definitely bought some antiquities while traveling. He mentions it, but he doesn't describe what they are. So he could have got it in Italy itself, or someone else could have brought it to London and sold it to him. He had so many pots, we don't know. So that's Samuel Rogers. And technically, I could have stopped there because we've established that it was outside Italy at an early date. But there's a big gap between 1855 and 1974, and I wanted to see if I could fill it in. So that meant going back to Stephen Courtauld. The Courtaulds were a wealthy family who made their money in the textile industry. And if you've heard of the Courtauld Institute in London, it's named for Stephen's brother Samuel. Both brothers were important supporters of the arts. In the 1930s, Stephen and his wife Virginia, who I'll say more about soon, were granted a 99-year lease from the British government on Eltham Palace, which had been used by Henry VIII, on the condition that they restore the Great Hall to its medieval Tudor splendor. But they were allowed to renovate and add on to the rest of the building in a modern style, and they turned it into an Art Deco masterpiece. It had a lot of very modern conveniences for the time, including heated floors and walls, a central vacuum system, and an intercom. Because it was such a stylish home, it was featured in architecture magazines at the time. And in my research, I found this photo of our vase displayed on the sideboard in the dining room. So that let me know that the Courtaulds had owned the vase by the 1930s, and that it was a really important part of the interior decoration. This is the grand dining room where they did a lot of entertaining. The palace is a museum now, and you can see in this recent color photo where they have a different vase on the sideboard because the previous one is here. But you can see how the vase not only fit into the design of the space, but how elements of the decor of the room were explicitly based on ancient Greek aesthetics, like the doors, for example. So my next step was to reach out to Eltham Palace, which, as I said, is a museum today run by English Heritage, to see if they had any records related to the vase. They had a contact form on their website, but you couldn't submit it without entering a UK phone number, so it didn't work for me. Instead, I tweeted at the Eltham Palace Twitter account asking them if they could put me in touch with an archivist, and they promptly did that. The archivist emailed me. It was great. And this is actually not the first or last time that Twitter has been useful in my research. It's actually really sad that now that it's become X and changed a lot, it's no longer this kind of resource for researchers and community that it used to be. So the archivist at Eltham sent me a couple of inventories of the Courtaulds' property. They weren't dated, unfortunately, but they did include some useful notes, such as that they actually owned 2 Greek vases, and that the vases had previously been owned by people named William Sharp and Mary C. Sharp. And the archivist told me that she wasn't entirely sure who these people were, but that Stephen's mother's maiden name was Sharp. And I had a vague memory of seeing the name Sharp linked to Samuel Rogers in my previous research, maybe as a relative. So I ended up going on Ancestry.com and creating a family tree for Stephen Courtauld. So it's a bit hard to read at this size, but the top here, this is Thomas Rogers. That was Samuel Rogers' father, and Samuel Rogers was one of 8 children that the couple had. And then we can sort of follow it down through, here is his nephew, William Sharp. Here is his daughter, Mary C. Sharp, and she is Stephen Courtauld's aunt. So Thomas Rogers is the second great grandfather of Stephen Courtauld. So even though we saw in the auction catalog that this vase was offered for sale when Rogers died, it stayed in the family. Maybe because no one else bought it, or maybe because his nephew decided that he particularly wanted it. So we can see here that Stephen got the vase and one other vase from his aunt, but when? Did she leave it to him in her will? And there's actually some visual evidence that's a clue to answering that question. Here is a portrait of Stephen and Virginia in their townhouse in London, surrounded by beautiful things that are important to them. Virginia is my next glamorous and eccentric woman. Her parents were Romanian and Italian, and she married an Italian count when she met Stephen in Italy when they were both in their 40s. And that marriage was annulled, and then she married Stephen. And she moved back to London with him. She was a famously fashionable woman, and she was known as an excellent hostess, and they hosted all sorts of people at Eltham Palace, including royalty. She also had a tattoo of a snake on one of her shins, which obviously was pretty unusual for a high society lady at the time. Also in this painting is another member of the family, the couple's pet lemur, Mahjong, that's how they spelled it, or Jongi for short. They got him at Harrods department store, and he lived a pampered life with them for 15 years. He had his own heated and decorated room at Eltham, and he traveled with the couple. So here's Jongi in his little personal deck chair on the deck of the Courtaulds' yacht. He's very cute. In fact, Jongi even accompanied Stephen on an Arctic expedition, but he caused quite a bit of trouble because when they were set to depart, he bit the wireless operator for the ship so badly that he got an infection and they had to delay the whole expedition several months. I don't think it's usually advisable to keep ring-tailed lemurs as pets, just so you know. Back to this portrait. Very rich portrait, full of details. These are things that the couple probably discussed with the artist as what they wanted to include to show who they were and what was important to them. So Jongi is right in the middle. Stephen is holding blueprints, and he has a pile of books behind him. The blueprints are probably the plans for the renovations of Eltham Palace. The room is filled with beautiful objects and works of art, demonstrating that they had a broad appreciation for art, and most importantly for my purpose, there is our vase. It was important enough that they made sure that it was identifiable in the background of their portrait. And since this was painted in 1934, and Aunt Mary seems to still have been alive then, that probably means that she gave the vases to Stephen as a gift while she was still alive. Maybe they were things that he had always admired when he visited her, I don't know. So when they moved from their townhouse to Eltham Palace, they took the vases with them. Unfortunately, the palace was hit by a number of German bombs starting in 1940, and they eventually moved out in 1944 and relocated to Scotland. And they transferred the lease on the palace to the British Air Force, who conducted training there. And then, as I said later, in the 1980s, it became a museum. The Courtaulds traveled after the war, and during a tour of Africa, they decided that they wanted to settle in Rhodesia, now called Zimbabwe, which was a British colony at the time. They built an estate there that they called La Rochelle, after the French town that Stephen's Huguenot ancestors had come from. And they were undoubtedly part of the colonial presence in the country, though they were perhaps a bit more liberal than some other colonists. For instance, in Stephen's obituary, it said that he announced that he would tear down the theater that he had funded rather than allow it to be racially segregated. The couple was also very active in arts and cultural patronage in Rhodesia. Stephen was the founding chair of the National Gallery and the university. He was a trustee of the university, and in his will, he left a large sum of money to found the National Trust. But this is about our vase. Did they take the vase to Africa? For those of you who have read my book, you'll see that that was still an open question at the time that it was published. I had written to some people at La Rochelle, which is now sort of a hotel, spa, botanical garden, and I had written to some people at the National Trust of Zimbabwe, and they were very helpful, but they weren't able to find any photos showing the vases inside La Rochelle. But Twitter to the rescue again. Totally by chance, I came across a tweet from an Oxford professor named Peter Stewart, who works in the Beasley Archive, which is a project attempting to catalog all of the Greek vases in the world. And he had photographed and tweeted a letter from their files that was written by Stephen Courtauld to the Greek art scholar John Beasley. So Stephen is sharing with him information about 2 pots that he says he inherited from his great-great-uncle Sam Rogers. So if I'd found this earlier, I wouldn't have had to do the Ancestry.com thing, but it's a nice confirmation of that family connection. He doesn't state explicitly that the vases are at La Rochelle, but the letter is postmarked from there, and it's implied. He doesn't say anything like, I left the pots in storage in London, so you're welcome to go look at them if you want. So I'm satisfied that at this point he has them with him in Rhodesia. The letter is actually really interesting. He goes on to tell Beasley that he is the chair of the National Gallery of Rhodesia, which still exists today as the National Gallery of Zimbabwe, which he calls perhaps the best designed art gallery in the world. But he mentions that they don't have a big collection, and he asks Beasley to consider directing donors who want to give art to museums to his gallery. What's especially striking to me is that he says, I am shocked at the concentration of so many works of art in so few big institutions. The National Gallery in London already offers too large a meal for most digestions. He goes on to say, if there is another war, all this will be blotted out, which is another good reason for dispersal. And this totally makes sense from someone in the 1950s whose London home was bombed during the recent war. But it also struck me because it's exactly the same argument that some people will make for keeping art and cultural objects in museums in the Western world or first world, because they're safer there than in, for example, Africa, whereas he's saying they would be safer in Africa. Of course, only a few years after the letter was sent, civil war broke out in Zimbabwe and lasted over a decade. But then again, I heard in the news last week that the outgoing head of the British Army said that the UK should start training and equipping a citizen army to prepare for a potential land war in the near future. So I think we have to keep in mind how quickly things change in terms of what parts of the world are safe, and maybe that's not the most important factor to determine where certain collections are housed. So that is my favorite artwork of everything I've researched, and it's not because of the vase itself. It's a very nice vase, but it's because of all the people who have come in and out of its orbit, who have found something special and important about it. Its significance has really changed through every phase of its existence. For the Etruscans, who presumably bought it as a Greek export, it was a sign of their wealth and culture, and it was a gift to honor their dead loved ones. For Samuel Rogers, it was part of his love of art, and art from Italy in particular, and it was a sign of his learning and good taste. It may have been a subject of conversation among the many guests who came through his house over the years. I don't really know enough about William and Mary Sharp to say what it meant to them, but maybe it was a connection to their uncle. For Stephen, it was a family heirloom. It was part of a broad interest in art and culture from around the world. And when Stephen and Virginia moved to Eltham and took the vases, they also became part of their modern Art Deco aesthetic, something to enhance their stylish home and to show off their impeccable taste. Then in La Rochelle, they might have been a link to home, back to England, to their family there, as well as having all these other meanings attached to them. When the San Antonio Museum Association bought the vase, it was a signal that they were planning to create a real world-class museum for San Antonio, which at the time at least required ancient Greek and Roman art. And today, in our gallery, the vase is a link to the ancient Greek past and is a tool for educating visitors about what was important to the Greeks and why we care about them today. So provenance is not just history, it's really art history, and it helps us to understand our art on a deeper level. I love to think about how many different people over the centuries looked at this vase and thought about where it came from and what it meant. All those visitors to Roger's house, all the guests to the Courtauld dinner parties. And then today we can all be part of the same story when we go to the galleries and ponder it ourselves. So that's the end of my stories for today, but I'm sure I'll find out more as I continue to research Sam's collection. And I want to say that I love to hear from people who have stories about the museum's history, or in particular, stories to tell about the past of objects in our collection. So you should always feel free to get in touch with me if you have anything to share. And I would be happy to take questions now. Yes. Well, so the question was, how many things have I found in the museum that are stolen? I haven't found any Nazi looted art. And like I said, I don't really find antiquities that are stolen, because when they're stolen, people are keeping that information secret. But we did return 2 groups of antiquities to Italy when other people who had more information than we had available shared with us that they had been associated with some dealers who had been convicted of smuggling and looting. So what tends to happen with my research is I find as much information as I can, I put it out there, and then if there's someone out there who has more that they can share with us, they may be able to identify things that have been looted. But I wouldn't say that I don't have the police in Italy and in particularly in Manhattan have that information, and they don't share it with us. Yes.
But when you get information, what is the hardest part of gathering all the information? Even with technology, what is the hardest part of gathering?
What is the hardest part of gathering information? I think sometimes the hardest part is knowing when to stop, because I'll get really focused on researching a particular object, and I'll look here and I'll not find anything. And I'll look here and I'll not find anything. And I'll keep looking at a lot of different places. And at a certain point, you have to say, okay, I'm not finding the information that I want to find now. It would be better use of my time to put this particular artwork aside and start researching something else. And maybe more information will appear. And that has definitely happened, because, I mean, like that letter that I showed on Twitter, but also archives and things become digitized that weren't digitized before. So you don't want to, there's a balance between going really in depth with specific works of art and trying to cover as much of the collection as you can. So that kind of balancing is sometimes a challenge. There's so many hands. At the front here? Yeah, yeah, so the question relates to what kind of conversations take place about certain museums or certain countries that have a lot of art, and maybe not everyone they're not able to display all of it, and maybe it would be easier to see in other parts of the world where they don't have quite as much. Yeah, that's definitely a debate that happens, and we don't know right now where the things that we've returned to Italy are, but I guess I would say it's kind of not up to us. Like, if they shouldn't have left Italy in the first place, then they can go back to Italy. But something that happens in a lot of cases, and also has happened here, is that if something is legally returned to another owner or another country, they might agree to loan it back to the museum that had it on display. So we have something like that in our collection. And if you've heard of Benin bronzes from Africa, the Smithsonian made an agreement where they would return some of them to Nigeria, but they would also keep others on display, just for that reason that people in Nigeria wanted people in America to be able to see this art and appreciate it as well. But yeah, it's definitely a conversation that I wouldn't say there's a resolution. It's ongoing. In the middle, green. Yes. Oh yeah. So the that comes from a letter that I found at the Library of Berkeley, where they hold the William Randolph Hearst papers. And so Hearst, if you don't know, he was a newspaper sort of magnate. He was the inspiration for Citizen Kane, that movie. If you've seen it, at the end, it shows like this warehouse just full of stuff that he's collected. But Hearst really did just collect tons of stuff. He had multiple houses full of art, full of furniture. He had warehouses on both coasts of the U.S. that were packed full of things. And so I just really loved this letter that I found in his archive, where the what's the word I'm looking for? The director, I guess, of one of his warehouses writes him a letter and says, someone from the New Yorker has stopped by and they would like to write about what you have in your warehouse. Can I take them in to show him? The New Yorker, by a rival publishing, conglomerate. And so Hearst writes back, absolutely not. He says that this could tempt some, quote, red nut to throw something explosive through the window. And he says, let us now not boast of our worldly possessions. This is in the 1930s, so he's trying to be cautious. And I just thought it was fun. Over there? That is a good question, because he did give other art to the museum. He gave paintings, impressionist paintings, and a bunch of other things to the museum. And I don't know the answer to that question. It was inherited by Virginia when he passed away, and she apparently took it with her when she moved back to England. And then after she died, it went up for sale. He gave his coin collection, he had a collection of ancient coins that he donated in his bequest, or gave in his bequest, I guess, to the University of Zimbabwe, now University of Zimbabwe. But no, I don't know. I do think that I would have to go back and look, but my memory of the museum is that it was established mainly with more modern art, a combination of modern art and African art, like the modern art from Europe and African art that they were focusing on, but so that might have been it, but yeah, I don't know. A little bit further back. Mhm. So the question is about if you're collecting art and the auction house, say, is not giving you information about where it came from, what can you do, right? If you're lucky, yeah. Yeah. This is really difficult. This is difficult for us in museums too, and this is difficult for me as a provenance researcher, because, yeah, even the big auction houses are not necessarily that forthcoming. There are privacy issues that have, maybe people don't want people to know that they own this really valuable art, and they might own other really valuable art. But there used to be a little bit more access to those records, and Christie's, for example, used to let researchers sometimes come and look through their archives, but they more recently have closed off access to those. I don't really have good advice. It's hard. You ask questions and try to get as much information as you can. Try to do as much searching as you can on your own, and then you just kind of have to make the decision if you feel like there's something crucial missing there that's going to, there's sort of a buyer beware element to it that you have to decide if it's a risk that's worth taking or if it can come back and cause you trouble in the future. I think we're out of time, but I will be out there if you want me to sign a copy of my book, and the shop is open, so you can buy copies if you like, or if you have other questions you want to get in line, I'll try to answer them for you there. But thank you so much.